I wanted to talk about what I mean by trauma healing and acknowledging trauma and working through trauma. I want to discuss a little bit from the perspective of a therapist why I don't necessarily think it's important to delve into the specific trauma as it was, but more so taking a holistic limbic system healing approach as being more effective and actually a gentler way of treating trauma. And I'm really grateful that you guys had started such great discussions on my last video and other videos to try to get this conversation going deeper. So thank you so much for asking those questions, because I think it really paves the way into a deeper discussion. So for those of you who are new, my name is Teresa, and I post videos on healing our limbic system and our nervous system to heal from pain and illness and trauma. And recently, there were some discussions around this importance of understanding collective trauma and generational trauma, not just the specific traumas that maybe happen to us that we might associate with something like PTSD, but maybe something that's been passed down through our family and is more subtle, or the collective trauma of things that we've gone through as a society. So my belief, especially being a therapist for almost 15 years, is that sometimes our traditional mode of talk therapy has been very harmful for us as far as healing from trauma. And so we can explain that, and that's why I'm so interested and passionate about brain retraining and neurolinguistic programming and positive psychology and limbic system healing. And that's because the more that we obsess or perseverate and identify with our trauma or our story or our narrative, it can actually become more damaging and keep us locked in a more negative and vicious cycle. So we know the role that the limbic system plays in chronic pain and illness and fight or flight mode. So the amygdala kind of gauges if there's a threat present and sets off this cascade of responses to put us in fight or flight mode if we feel there's a risk. And that works very closely with the hippocampus, which is where we store memory. So when we're doing talk therapy or narrative therapy, where we are expecting people to almost, I would say, obsess over their trauma and retell it over and over in a therapy setting or a journaling setting, or people start to identify with their trauma, or we fall down this negative feedback loop of watching the news and hearing that collective trauma over and over, or politics that get us wrapped up in the anger and kind of this trauma response, right? Like if our individual response to a trauma trigger or a chronic pain or chronic illness trigger is fight or flight in the moment, in that cascade of physical symptoms and side effects and maybe emotional symptoms and side effects. Well, we can see that play out on a grander scale with collective trauma. And I think collectively, the traumas we've been through the last, few decades even, or even just the last few years, we are collectively and societally in a state of fight or flight. And I think that's why we're seeing so many more people than ever before are just so bitter and hostile, and there's a lot of violence and anger as a whole in our society. So as a therapist, I really prefer things like acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, radical acceptance, mindfulness, somatics, more holistic and Eastern-based philosophies. And I like them in particular because they allow us to process and let go of trauma as it's stored in our bodies, in our souls, in our energies, in our consciousness, without obsessing over the trauma itself. We are more so healing our reaction and our reactivity to the trauma. So many of you might have heard that quote that trauma is not your fault, but healing is your responsibility. I don't know initially who that saying is like ascribed to, but I hear it all the time. It's like, on every single like meme I've seen about trauma. So let's kind of break down that statement a little bit. So we have to start by acknowledging trauma is not your fault, right? So even if we've fallen into this narrative of feeling like a victim or victimization from trauma, the initial trauma is not your fault. Whether you got sick or had an accident or someone hurt you, or collectively you experienced trauma, you're not to blame for that. And this can result from a wide range of experiences. And so we want to make sure that we're not falling into self-blame and guilt. But healing the trauma is your responsibility. Once you know the trauma is there, and you understand that the trauma has shaped your behavior and your emotions in certain ways, you can't just fall into that victimhood of saying, well, I'm traumatized, so I have a free pass to do this, or well, I'm traumatized, so I'm never going to heal, I'm just going to be sick forever, right? The healing is where our responsibility to change comes in. And so we have to recognize that we're the only ones who can save ourselves. Like, no one else can come in and do the work for us or save us. And having the bitterness and anger and resentment about maybe where the trauma came from or what the trauma was is only hurting you. It's not hurting the people who hurt you. It's not changing the global situations that are hurting you. We have to take responsibility for the trauma has affected me in these ways. Maybe my limbic system is dysregulated. Maybe I feel sick all the time. Maybe I'm angry all the time. Maybe I'm now more vulnerable to other people hurting me. I'm noticing emotional or relational patterns from my trauma with like codependency or addiction. But the only thing that I can do is change my own habits and behaviors and thoughts and emotions to change those patterns. So we obviously have different things we have to consider. If this trauma is at a point where you feel powerless over it, seeking professional help from a therapist is key. And I think you really need to consider, do you want a somatic therapist, an acceptance and commitment therapist, a spiritual therapist? I think those are a great way to start. EMDR or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy can be really helpful for what we would call like big T trauma, like a specific trauma that we know is there that we can't get out of our head, and reprocessing it in a way that our brain stores it differently in our hippocampus. But when it comes to collective trauma or a whole collection of traumas over the course of our life, or something that we can't just say, I want to work on this one moment, that's where I think things like the somatics and the radical acceptance and the spirituality come in. We also have to retain this idea of self-compassion, because our healing journey is going to be challenging. It's not linear. And we need to know there's going to be setbacks, and we have to be kind to ourselves and acknowledge our process. And we have to have patience because healing takes time. And we have to feel empowered that taking this responsibility means that we are making new choices. We are breaking a cycle. Oftentimes, our trauma has had cycles, whether it's through our own family or our own culture, for a long time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about two types of therapy I think are super helpful. So acceptance and commitment therapy, this is helping us to develop psychological flexibility. And this means that we're present in the moment. We accept the difficult emotions and thoughts and states that come up when they do. And then we commit that despite any of the discomfort or what we've been through, we're committing to actions that align with our values and beliefs. So a lot of times I'll have people do a pie chart and say, like, where are your values? What do you spend your time identifying with or worrying about now? And if you had to make that same pie chart in an ideal situation, what would that look like? What are the things that you are committed to doing in your life that bring you joy, that bring you purpose? We first have to work on accepting the difficult emotions. So these could be things like fear, anger, guilt, sadness, isolation. And instead of suppressing or avoiding them with ACT, we are learning to observe them and experience them, but not judge them and not push them away. So we need to develop this willingness to do hard things, to experience the emotions as they are without trying to tone them down too much, just allowing them. And what we have to kind of notice is, and that's where I like internal family systems, which I've talked about before, but we do have parts of ourselves that want to just put out emotional fires at all costs. Sometimes if we let ourselves feel the emotion and realize that no matter how bad it feels, it's just an emotion, it's just a state, it comes and goes, it's not permanent, that's where mindfulness comes in, that it doesn't feel as scary. So first we have to accept that. Then step 2 of ACT would be mindfulness, and that is being fully present in the moment and observe our thoughts and feelings without being attached to them or identifying with them. So this is that we can get spiritual here, or we can keep it totally brain science based, but we have a center, a soul, a sense of self, an ego, whatever we want to call it, that exists, that just is, and that is kind of the makeup of what we are in our innermost being. And our thoughts are not that. Our thoughts exist, our brain creates thoughts, and our hormones and brain create emotions, but we exist independently of those. So with mindfulness, we're observing that they come and go, but that they don't define us. And this is a skill that helps us become aware of our reactivity and our triggers, but then create space so that we can respond like mindfully and thoughtfully rather than impulsively. We also are looking at diffusion. So cognitive diffusion is when we're trying to distance ourselves from the reactivity of those thoughts and memories. So again, we're recognizing that those thoughts are not facts. They're just thoughts that come up about the trauma, and they don't have to control our emotions and behavior. Values clarification and committed action is where we identify core values, those things that are the most meaningful and the most important to us, and then aligning our actions to be with those values. So even if we have challenges or trauma or emotions or pain, we engage in activities that give us joy, accomplishment, purpose, presence, even if there's some discomfort there, because that's like what we're created to do, right? And I've referenced this before. I've heard a lot of people kind of make this generalized statement, like a lot of the problems that arise for people is that we're just bored. And I don't mean that in any kind of disparaging way. It's as a society, right? Like we used to have to wake up and milk the cows and feed the animals and plow the fields and harvest our food, and it took a lot of effort just to survive, but it was in a lot of holistic ways, and we were outside in nature and we were working with our bodies. We're just bored as a society. Everything's automated and packaged and processed, so it's not good in a lot of ways. But even people that that are very disabled and can't do a lot of times what we're talking about in therapy is that they actually just feel bored. They feel like they don't have purpose. So we have to find a way, whether that's even volunteering on a hotline to help other people that are struggling. It doesn't have to be getting out and doing something physical, but giving that sense of purpose and value. And I know we've talked about self-compassion, but it's like being understanding and kind about yourself and where you are so that we can still work on that resilience. And then we're defining a new relationship with the trauma. So we know we're never going to get rid of the trauma. We're not aiming to eliminate the trauma memories. That doesn't exist, right? But we want to change our relationship with the memories. So we know that they're painful and that they might always be there somewhere, but they don't have to dictate our whole life. And again, it's like diffusing them. Like if you have a little cup of experience, you have a little cup and you put one drop of food dye in there, it's going to color the whole cup. You're not going to be able to mistake that that's in there. But if you have an entire ocean and you put a drop of dye in there, you don't notice it, right? So the more depth and breadth and experience we give ourselves, the more we give ourselves to think about and spend time on and energy on, it diffuses the trauma so it no longer feels like it's all encompassing. So I think that's an important way that ACT plays in here. I also want to talk about radical acceptance, and radical acceptance exists a little bit with ACT because of the acceptance piece, but it's actually a skill that came from DBT, or dialectical behavior therapy, from Marsha Linehan. And it's not specifically a trauma technique, but it is a therapy technique. And so with this, we acknowledge reality as it is and accept it as it is. And that includes the presence of trauma. But then we take a non-judgmental stance. So we work on not labeling emotions or reactions as good or bad, but just observing them without criticism or blame and saying, like, are these working for me? And letting go of resistance. So trauma often evokes this really intense, distressing emotional response. So it's natural for us that we try to just push it away and avoid it. But radical acceptance means that we let go of that struggle against the difficult emotions and we allow them to be present and just acknowledge them and notice what they're doing. And again, mindfulness comes in here. There's a lot of parallels with ACT therapy here. We're fully present in the moment. We observe. We look at our thoughts and our emotions, our bodily sensations with curiosity, but not attachment, not identifying with them. And this again then allows us to see our triggers and respond better. And it also cultivates a sense of calmness in our nervous system. So we don't feel like we are on this roller coaster of our fight or flight response kicking in, our amygdala kicking in. We feel like, well, we don't have to go down that roller coaster if we don't want to. We can step out of line and just observe. Again, self-compassion is huge here. And then reframing our perspective. So we want to reinterpret our experiences, and we want to find meaning or learning and resilience from our trauma story and acknowledge the growth potential and our strengths and our resilience that we have as trauma survivors. And again, it's not saying that we're positive psychology sugarcoat whitewashing it. It's this idea, though, of we have to figure out, when do we step off the ride? When do we decide that we no longer are going to let our trauma story dictate our life and our response and turn us bitter or angry or basically paralyze us with physical symptoms? And to know that the empowerment of fighting back against the initial trauma comes from reclaiming our strength and reclaiming our lives and purpose. So I hope this explained a little bit deeper into my clinical understanding of trauma, why I like these tools better than the old school talk therapy where we're obsessing over the trauma story itself. I want to take a wider lens. And this is where, when we go into brain retraining, there's so much work on visualizing ourselves healed, and there's so much work on just breath work and mindfulness and meditation where we're taking control, that we can change our physical state and put our nervous system into a parasympathetic relaxed state, and that we can change our reaction to a trauma narrative that still is there. We're not getting rid of the emotions, the memories, the thoughts, but we're able to find that space of mindfulness, have compassion, and then choose to take a different road and respond differently than we have before, which now creates new neural pathways, new ways of being, new behavior patterns. So over time, we change our whole lives. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you guys have an awesome day full of healing, and we'll talk soon.